Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
Without further ado, Professor Peter Ditto is a professor of psychological science. This, by the way, is a transition that I experienced in my life. We all thought it was psychology departments, but they have gotten much more uppity. And they want to distinguish themselves from the social sciences. They want to be with the, is this not true, sir? Okay, tell a story about that, because you know they want to be with the hard sciences. Unfortunately, physics and chemistry they quite are not, but they're happy to kind of merge with the biology folks. So I think that's what that's about. When I looked on his website, it says Professor of Psychological Science. He is director also of the Hot Cognition Lab. The Hot Cognition Lab. The lab studies how emotions and motivation affect how people think and what they believe. Professor Ditto prefers the term factual beliefs to the term facts, which of course aligns him with great philosophers like Plato, Hume, and Kant. He has published works with titles like At Least Bias is Non-Partisan, Fake News, False Memory, and Changing Attitudes in the 2016 election, and How Moral Judgments Impact Perceived Risk from COVID-19 Exposure. Professor Ditto received his BA from UCLA and his PhD from Princeton. His title this evening is Through the Partisan Looking Glass, The Psychology of Political Polarization. Please join me in welcoming Peter Ditto.
Thanks for having me. So, a lot of you might remember this day. A few days after Donald Trump was elected president, his advisor, Kellyanne Conway, was on TV and dropped this wonderful phrase, alternative facts. Right? And a lot of people freaked out about that, right? It seemed like that she was saying, if you take this to mean sort of metaphysical reality, like there's two different sets of realities, well then it's a problematic statement. If you take it as factual beliefs, it's really very mundane, right? We all have different beliefs about things. We disagree about almost everything in life, right? And so the fact that people have alternative beliefs about facts really isn't that surprising. What's more problematic is when those alternative beliefs line up really nicely with group differences or with political differences. And that's the problem that we have right now, is we have two political groups that each have their own sets of facts. They have alternative factual beliefs about things, about the way the world works. And it spans all kinds of different beliefs. Let me just give you a couple, and I'll just show you some graphs. They're super simple graphs, right, because you don't need to do this. It doesn't need to be depicted in any complicated way. So, for example, this is just polling questions. Did the Russians interfere with the 2016 election? Again, it's a factual belief because they either did or they didn't, right? We may not know that, but they either did or they didn't. And what you find is that most Democrats think that they did, most Republicans think that they didn't, and most moderates are right in the middle. And that's the pattern you see with just about everything. So the 2020 election, were the results of the 2020 election fair? Most Democrats think yes, most Republicans say no, and independents right in the middle. But it isn't just elections. So here's one. Are police tougher on blacks, or do they treat blacks and whites about the same? Democrats mostly think they're tougher on blacks. Republicans think they treat them the same. Moderates in the middle. How about something like the weather? Has the weather been more extreme in the last few years? Most Democrats say yes, most Republicans say no, moderates right in the middle. That's the pattern you see, where the two sides seem to have diametrically opposed factual beliefs, or at least so the majority of them do, right? And so that's what we want to try to understand, is why this is happening. Let me give you one more example. This is a little bit, these are data that we just collected about COVID-19 beliefs, right? So this is one where these factual beliefs really make a big difference, right? So these are these wonderful data collected by my colleague Roxanne Silver, who gets right in. So these data were collected, in the first phase was March, April 2020. So that was just a week or two after the pandemic started, right? And then we've been asking them questions every few months since then. And this is just the first wave. So this is whether you think how serious a risk of death does COVID pose, right? And so on the top these are just the strong Democrats, moderate Democrats, independents, moderate Republicans, extreme Republicans down here. And you see there's this clear difference, right? Where Democrats think that COVID posed a much greater risk of death than did Republicans. And that played itself out in terms of behavior. So they were also, when we asked them to report on their behaviors, these are nationally representative data. So these are really, really good data, right? And so they also are much more likely, Democrats are much more likely to act in ways that were consistent with that. So to socially distance, to wear masks, to ultimately, and this was pre-vaccine, but ultimately to get vaccine. And you also, the other thing you see is this sort of the spreading out phenomenon. So you might imagine in a world where you're experiencing the same thing, everybody's watching the same things happen, that people's beliefs would converge. Eventually you'd start to see the same thing. You can imagine, that's not what you're seeing at all. It spreads out. It gets even more extreme over time when the two sides get more and more dug in. And what's so remarkable about this is just a piece of data, or sort of the pattern of data in all this, right, is you can draw a very direct line from politics all the way to death. So being Republican was the third most powerful risk factor in dying from COVID, behind race and age. Right, so it goes, you can trace it from their politics to their beliefs, to their behavior, to their illness, to being hospitalized, to death, right? All those data exist. You can draw that line, right? So this is the time when these alternative facts really make a difference, right? So how do these things occur? Why do we have these different sets of facts? And how does it all fit in with this crazy world that we're in, this crazy, corrosive, politically polarized world? And they're all sort of tied together. And so this is what I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about, again, I've got tons and tons of data. I'm going to try to skip over most of the data or just talk about it very generally and sort of talk about how it is the psychology of polarization. So how does this sort of happen? What's the context of it all? And I'm going to talk about three different factors that are involved, that I call moralization, factualization, and socialization. Right? And each of these sort of contribute to the process. Now, the things I always say when I start off is, first of all, again, I'm a psychologist. I'm not a political scientist, right? So I'm really interested in what people believe about everything, right? So their perceptions of things. I don't really talk about what the true political world is, right? I'm trying to understand the way people think about it. And I try to stay as nonpartisan as possible. I have political beliefs just like everybody else, but to study this as a scientist, you kind of have to try to detach yourself from that the best you can, which is very difficult. And that's, you'll see, in the context of the talk, why it is difficult. But let's talk about each of these things in turn. So, the first concept is this idea of moralization, moralization is just the infusion of preferences with moral value. When you take something that people might just be imagined as something you choose, and then it becomes moralized. It's become one choice becomes morally good, and the other morally bad. Right? This happens in all kinds of things. The sort of classic example that people talk about is smoking. So smoking, when we were younger, was simply a preference. It was just something that people did, right? And there wasn't a lot of stigma associated with it. And then over time it became moralized, where that choice, where you see, oh, there's a smoker, oh, that's bad, that's a morally bad thing to do, they're a morally bad person, in a sense, right? So you see that it used to be a preference and it sort of becomes this moral value. So the same sort of process is going on in politics. So you could imagine a politics that was not moralized, right? So this is sort of my oversimplified version of politics. So you've got liberal economics 101, which is you raise taxes on the wealthy, invest in the safety net, you raise the minimum wage, for example. Conservative economics, cutting taxes, cutting safety nets, cutting regulations, right? And so the two sides have different beliefs and these preferences for these different policies, right? And one way to view it is this sort of pragmatic view. This is the sort of, and these are idealized views. So one way to think about this is, gee, you have your views, I have my views. We both want the same thing. We're both trying to help the country and save things. You just have a different idea about how to get there. We both have the same intentions, but we have different ideas about sort of the economic manipulations that might get us there, right? So at that point, this is the idea that your opponent in politics could be like your loyal opponent, right? This is somebody who I respect them because they have different views, but we both want the same thing. And at worst, their policies, they're misguided about how to get there. They have good intentions, they don't know how to get there. Misguided, or at worst, they're dumb, right? You're dumb, your ideas are dumb, right? That dumb's bad, but it's not the worst thing that can happen. There's another way, however, that you can imagine politics, and that's sort of this moralized view. When the other side isn't dumb, the other side is evil. So you aren't even trying to do the same thing. We're trying to help the country, your side is trying to hurt it. Right? So it's not that you're dumb, you know what you're doing, it's that you're evil, you're bad, you're morally bad, you have the wrong intentions. And that's sort of the way politics is operating now, right? Where the two sides view themselves as enemies and not just loyal opponents, right? But as real adversaries. The way we've described this is during COVID, there was a conference I was supposed to go to, and it got canceled because of COVID, so we decided, well, what are all these scientists? These were sort of the leading people in the country who studied polarization. There were psychologists, political scientists, economists, and so we couldn't meet, so we decided to sit down and try to write a paper and try to summarize the literature on polarization and interpret it. And the paper that we ended up writing ended up in Science magazine, and we talked a lot about how to describe the process. So one way people describe the process is tribalism, right? At one point the paper was going to be political tribalism, but we ultimately decided to call it political sectarianism, right? To capture that there's this, when things are moralized, it's sort of a pseudo-religious experience, right? It's the other side is, again, doesn't share your intentions. They sort of have a different set of religious values. So in the United States, you see this. It's as if we have the left and the right. They're each two sides of this American civil religion. Each side convinced that they know what the founders really, really wanted, right? And we're the ones that are honoring what the founders wanted. And you're sacrilegious. You believe in some false gods that have been foisted upon you, right? And so in that sense, this is the way the two sides sort of interact, right? They interact less like Democrats and Republicans and more like Shias and Sunnis, in a sense, right? Where there's a real animosity between the two. Some of the data that we were sort of talking about here, some of the phenomenon, just to give you some of the terms, right, is that what you see in the country in data is something called affective polarization. So you've heard of like polarization, you think of polarization of beliefs, like beliefs get more extreme. And you do see a little bit of that, clearly in politics, but what's striking is this affective polarization, that it's that the two sides increasingly dislike each other, right? So there's what they periodically in political science, they have people do these thermometer ratings where you rate, oh, here's my party, how do you rate, on a scale from 0 to 100, how warmly do you feel about them? Here's the other party, how warmly do you feel about them? And what you see is that if you look at those over time, it's consistently gone down. The difference between the two has gone up, right? So that we like there's an increasingly difference in how we rate our side and the other side. But it's not that we like our own side more. What you clearly see is this other phenomenon, which is negative partisanship, which is it's not that we like our own side more, it's we hate the other side more. And you clearly see this kind of trend going down and how they rate increasingly rate the other side is less warm. And then if you sort of weight the two against each other, this is that out-group hate sort of has now overwhelms in-group love. If you kind of calculate it that way. So the phenomenon is this negative partisanship. And you see it in lots of different dimensions. You see it in, if you ask people, for example, in politics there are, you get rated as a Democrat, Republican, or a leaner, right? Somebody who's in the middle leaning. And so if you look at those people and you ask the people who are leaning, why are you leaning? So some are leaning toward Democrats, some are leaning towards Republicans. You ask them, why are you leaning toward your side? You might think, oh, because I like the Democrats a little bit better. But that's not what they say. They say, I'm leaning toward the Democrats because I hate the Republicans more, right? Or vice versa, right? So it's all this sort of, and there's this negativeness, right? It seems that it's this moralized kind of religious sense of this other side. They just don't have different opinions. They're evil. They have they have ill intention for the country. One of my favorite examples is sort of just to kind of capture sort of in a single data point kind of how bad this is the question of how would you feel if your child married a Republican, right? It's the question, right? When my daughter, my oldest daughter, married a kid who was a Republican at the time. He's not anymore. We called it a mixed marriage, right? So that was, and you see that this was something that for years people didn't care too much about, although it increases. And then you see about 2008, 2009, this really sharp increase where people say, I don't care, you can marry somebody of a different race, you can marry somebody of the same gender, just don't bring home a Republican or don't bring home a Democrat, right? That captures how deep this is, right? This feeling of dislike for the other side. So when I talk about moralization, there's kind of three kinds of moralization I want to talk about really quickly. Three senses in which I mean that word. So there's issue moralization, which is just the idea that that some of the disagreement is that we have different moral values, right? And we feel differently about issues through the lens of our morals. So there's this sort of moralization of politics. Politics should be moral, right? Politics is about having a moral vision and trying to enact that moral vision through policy, right? But it seems that increasingly our politics is about moral issues, things that like gay marriage, transgender issues. It used to be torture, abortion, and even issues that aren't sort of naturally moral become sort of moralized. So again, this is just a quote from Al Gore about global warming is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue. Here's John Boehner. This debt is a mortal threat to our country. It's also a moral threat. So this sort of moral lens. And the two sides disagree about moral issues. And that's natural. That's exactly what you'd expect, right? So let me tell you a little bit about sort of the psychology of this. And this is work that I did with a guy named Jonathan Haidt, who's very well known. If you want to read a book that sort of captures sort of the essence of this book, The Righteous Mind, which is a New York Times bestseller, it's a beautiful book articulating the vision. Somewhere in one of the chapters it talks about how the two of us met and our graduate students really kind of brought us together. But what we worked on was this idea that's called moral foundation theory. And moral foundation theory is really just a theory of morality across the world. It's not about politics specifically, right? But it's about this idea that people have these sort of, the moral systems in the world are built on five different intuitions. Five intuitions about what's wrong, why things are wrong or right. They're kind of like moral taste buds, right? They're things that kind of get us when we hear things that violate one of these intuitions, right? We go, oh, that seems bad. And when they support them, we say that feels good. And again, everybody, so the idea is that everybody across cultures builds their moral systems on all five of these. Everybody's sensitive to all five. But you get group differences. Sometimes some kind of feeling, some intuition is elevated through cultural or individual factors. Sometimes they're suppressed. So you get different groups having different sort of weighting of these factors. And that's what you see in politics, right? Is that the liberals and conservatives have a different way of thinking about morality. So there's these are the five. This is just a simplified version. These are the 5 different foundations. This is a sample of 194,000 people. This is a huge sample. We had a website called yourmorals.org that we had people come to all the time, collected hundreds, something I think about 800,000 people ultimately were in the data set. And these are just ratings of a scale that we use to measure how people report their morality. So this is kind of rating these things as sort of how morally relevant they are from really, this is really relevant to my morality, and this isn't really relevant to my morality at all. And these are from very, very liberal to very conservative. So this is a political dimension here, right? And some of the dimensions are just without going into a lot of detail, harm. So it's wrong to harm people, right? Particularly vulnerable people. And it's good to sort of care for vulnerable people. So that's one of the core, that's probably the central moral principle in all, in moral systems, right? It's wrong to hurt people. And what you see in that one is that, again, liberals are high on this. They say that's very harm-related issues are very relevant to them, and stays consistent over time. You know, conservatives feel that way as well. The second one is fairness, which is just this intuitive sense of justice we have. People should be treated equally. People should get back about what they put in, that sort of thing. And again, that's another one that almost everybody endorses very equally. And then you get 3 that show a different pattern. In-group loyalty, whether it's morally good to be loyal to your in-group, to your family, to your country, to things like that, that there's something really essentially, that being a traitor is worse than being other, that's one of the worst things you could be, to betray people, right? To betray a group. That's the in-group loyalty. Authority is respect for authority, respect for tradition. You should respect the way things are, the way people in traditional authority positions act. And then purity is sort of this essential that things should be pure, right? That your soul should be pure in a religious sense. You should keep your body pure. That your body should be a temple, not a plaything. Right? These ideas that there's something essential about sort of moral purity that's powerful. And all of these 3 factors show a very different sort of relationship. So those are ones that liberals don't think are moral at all, and conservatives do. Right? So those are ones that the liberals go, whether you do something, whether you're patriotic or not, that's not really important to me. Right? Whether you show respect to authority. In fact, I think you should question authority. Right, and purity, sex doesn't hurt anybody, and drugs are fine, and they're things that you can choose, but they aren't moral things. Right, so what you end up with is that liberals basically have this 2-factor morality. If it doesn't harm somebody, or if it isn't unfair, it's not really immoral. Right? Conservatives have the more traditional pattern, which you see mostly across the world, which is all 5 of these things matter. Right, in-group loyalty, loyalty to authority and purity, right? All those things matter as well, right? So they apply all 5 of those to moral situations. So this kind of helps to explain what you see in a lot of patterns. So just take an example like same-sex marriage, right? So through the liberal lens, it's an unadulterated good. It doesn't harm anybody, right? You can get gay married. I don't have to. It's fine. No harm. Done. It's only fair. The idea of marriage equality, right? So everybody should be able to get married, right? So for liberals, same-sex marriage is an unadulterated good. For conservatives, they feel some of these same things, right? They feel about harm and fairness, right? They get that, but they have these other concerns, right? Gee, they aren't really good group members. If you hear people say, well, if gay people just act like everybody else, if they just wouldn't dress up and do things, then I'd like them better. Right? They're not good group members. And it's not traditional, right? So we all know traditional marriage is man and woman, the way it's always been through history, right? And so they don't do things traditionally. And I try not to throw around technical words, but there's something icky, right, about the whole thing. Right? It doesn't feel pure, it doesn't feel right. Right? So the idea is that even if you're not, you don't have to sort of imagine somebody being a homophobe, right? To say, well, I don't know how I feel about same-sex marriage. There's things that are okay about it, right? But there's other things that bother me. People don't vote for things that they're ambivalent about, right? And so it helps to understand why it is that something like that doesn't go down as easily. Now, what's remarkable, right, is that how the massive social change that's happened in the last 10 years, and how much support for same-sex marriage has gone up. And a lot of that's probably something like this, where when people are covered up, you don't know what they're doing, right? You don't know that people are gay. You don't know that your neighbor's gay. You don't know that your dentist is gay. Let people come out, and you go, oh, well, the people I know are on TV, they're gay. People are gay. Everything's fine, right? So it sort of familiarizes you with people, and that's probably what's happening. But again, the idea is that the two sides have different sets of moral values, and they apply them to situations, right? And so they're going to come up with different ideas. So it's natural to have moral differences. And of course, you can imagine a world in which we talk calmly about our moral differences. Okay, you feel like this, I feel like this, but that's not really the way moral conversations go, right? People tend to fight. Once you have a moral difference, it starts to sink in, and people dislike each other. When somebody else has a different moral view than you say, wow, I'm questioning what they're like as a person, right? So it seeps down deeper, right? And this is what we see. So it's not so. Beyond sort of this issue moralization, we have these different moralized issues. There's personal moralization, which is, I think you're a bad person, right? I think the other side are bad people. That's not just that they have different moral views. I think they're morally people of bad character. So there's just a couple. You can see any of these anywhere. I just pulled a couple of nice quotes out. Here's Steve Schmidt, who actually technically is a Republican, but of course he's been very anti-Trump, or was. And so here's the Republican Party is corrupt, indecent, and immoral. They have disgraced their country and brought dishonor to the party of Lincoln. The GOP has become a danger to our democracy and our values. You've got Tucker Carlson on the other side. The leaders of today's Democratic Party despise this country. They've said so. They continue to. This is shocking, but it's also disqualifying. We cannot let them run this nation because they hate it. Imagine what they would do to it. Right? So the two sides clearly look at the other side and say, the other side is filled with bad people. Right? If you want some data on this, these aren't my data, this is a friend of mine, a very prominent researcher, and he did this nice study where he just asked people, he gave them a whole bunch of statements like actions like wrongful imprisonment, tax fraud, embezzlement, etc. And he asked people, first of all, how many of you approve of these things? Right? And then, what percentage of the other party do you think approves of these things? Right? So you get data from both Republicans and Democrats about how much they really approve of these things, and then you get data on how much the other side thinks they approve of these things. So again, what you see is the same pattern on each side, is almost nobody really approves of these things. Right? So almost no Democrats approve of these things, but Republicans think that lots of Democrats approve of cheating on their spouse and approve of tax fraud. Same thing the other way, right? So we overestimate how much we think, that we essentially sort of view them as, most of them sort of lack of basic morality, right? He calls this the basic morality bias, right? So this is what we see, right? We tend to come, it's not just that they have different moral views, but they're bad people, right? That's the kind of personal moralization. There's one other really contributor to moralization that I've been really interested in recently, and that's this idea of grievance. Right, that people have a grievance, and what it means when you feel like you've been screwed, right, by somebody, and what that licenses you to do. So to me, the archetype of human conflict to me is two kids in the back seat of a station wagon. How many people have been in this situation? Right? They start fighting, right? They start beating on each other, and then you say, "What's going on back there?" And the first one says, "He hit me first." And the other one says, "Well, he hit me harder," right? That's human conflict, right? That is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is what conflicts are like. Two sides who feel aggrieved. They each have something to say, something was wrong with me. He hit me first. Well, he hit me harder, right? And once you feel aggrieved, you feel justified, right? This is like, now I've been wronged. I can lash back out again. Right? And it moralizes the situation. It says that once you've done bad things to me, which is what groups do to each other over time. They offend each other in various ways. And we can all see the kind of offenses, perception of stealing elections. This was a nice fair election that you had, it seemed to me. I don't know. Look fair. This guy's a little shady looking, but maybe. Right? But people have these different grievances, and what the problem with these sort of feelings of grievance, right? They generate anger, and they license you to lash back, right? So if you think you've been wronged, right, you feel, well, it's okay for me to wrong them. If you steal an election from me, I'll steal one back from you. If you want to steal a Supreme Court justice from me, I'm going to steal one back from you. Something I used to think was wrong, but now it's okay, right? Because the whole system is moralized. And you see a lot of that, right? The country is sort of roiling in grievance, and then the chief sort of grievance meister, right, is Donald Trump has made this as sort of raison d'etre, right? And again, this wonderful quote is, "I'm your warrior, I'm your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution." Right? That's the idea. So you have done wrong to me, and so it's okay for me to do wrong back to you. Right? So you get this moralized. So this is what I'm telling you. So you have this moralized political atmosphere where you're viewing the other side as evil, as bad character, and it's behaving unfairly to you and wronging you. Right? And so we start with that. So the whole system is sort of worked up in all these ways. The second factor in all of this is what I call factualization, right? And that's the recruitment of descriptive beliefs to support prescriptive intuitions. I know there's a lot of jargon in there, but the idea is once we have these moral views, right, we recruit facts in a way that supports those, to make it clear that our moral views really are right, because they're supported by facts. So the way this, again, kind of happens is that once you, so if I asked you, let me back up, if I asked you how you formed your political opinion, you would likely give me a story that had something to do with principles, facts, and logic. I have this basic set of principles, maybe that I learned from my parents, right? I put those together with facts of the world, and I use my logical capacity, and all those things. That's how I came to be a Democrat, or that's how I came to be a Republican, right? And there's some truth to that. Some things go that way, right? But what psychology overwhelmingly would tell you is that very often the process goes the other way as well, right? So that it's more that your political beliefs and moral views shape the principles that you endorse, the facts that you believe, and it can warp your logic in various ways to support those things, so that it changes the way you process information to sort of support your logical views or your political and moral beliefs, right? We've done research on all of these different factors. I won't go into a lot of this, but again, how it is that people's political views change the way they use principles, the way the kind of facts they believe, and even the way they use logic. Let me sort of explain what I mean by this factualization idea, right? And so, again, we've got our political views up here, and there's the underlying those, let's say, is a moral view. So liberals say, well, the right thing to do is to help people. That's a pretty good characterization of liberal moral view. The right thing to do is help people in need. The conservative moral view, right, is something like the right thing to do is teach people responsibility. We've got to teach people responsibility. So each of them have sort of a moral, and those are legitimate moral positions that you can have. You can believe those things to be true. Now, the problem is that once you have those things, they shape your belief in the facts. So, again, most liberals, it's not that they just think that helping people is the right thing to do. They say helping people is going to make the economy better. It's going to make the GDP go up, right? So the data show that higher taxes and better safety net are going to improve the economy, right? Because if you do the moral thing, everything's going to work out, right? It's not just the moral thing to do, it's the effective thing to do. Conservatives have the opposite view. The right thing to do is to teach people responsibility, and the data show that if you lower taxes and have a strict safety net, that improves the economy. So everybody thinks the facts are on their side, so they sort of build this foundation, right, for their moral views. It's not just that I have this is just not my moral opinion, the facts support me too, right? I don't think that gay people should be adopting children, and you know what, the data show that children from gay couples don't do as well, right? So they come up with the facts that support their moral view and make their moral view correct. Here's a great example. We've done tons of work, and you see that people do this on almost everything, that the more moral they think things are, the more effective they think things are. So the more moral people think the death penalty is, the more effective they think it is, the more they think it deters crime, and the less they think you have wrongful executions, right? And it works on everything. The more you sort of believe stem cell research is morally bad, the less you think it's actually going to help anybody. So everybody has this sort of connection, right? So we end up with this funny sort of pattern where people almost always believe that the moral thing to do is the most effective thing to do. So let me give you an example here. How many people think that waterboarding terrorist subjects is an immoral thing to do? Okay, just keep your hands up and take them down. How many of you think it's an effective thing to do? That it works? So why is it that people think this is the pattern that you see? Almost nobody, so you have that you believe?
Well, technically it does work.
Yeah, so there's no reason, morality is different from effectiveness. So you can say it's morally wrong, it works, but it's morally wrong. But almost nobody ever says that. Almost everybody that thinks it's morally wrong thinks it's ineffective. Almost everybody that thinks it's morally right thinks it's effective, right? And that's because they kind of combine these things together. This is a great quote from Bill Clinton that really captures that. He says, if you raise the minimum wage and it pays wage, it always creates jobs. Why? Because people who make the minimum wage or near it are struggling to get by. He sort of talks about it. He says, again, it's just the right thing to do, but it's also very good economics, right? That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Something could be the right thing to do and be bad economics, right? But nobody thinks that. So people recruit beliefs to sort of support their moral views. I won't go into this study, but let me talk about, so how do they get these? How do they recruit these facts, right? Well, they recruit these facts because we tend to take in information that we want to believe and reject information we don't want to believe, right? And we show this sort of bias pattern. This is sort of a classic old study that was done actually by one of my professors at Princeton, and it's a kind of study that's done where you give people exactly the same information, but you make it sort of friendly to liberals or friendly to conservatives, and then you see how people process it. So in this study, it was all about whether the death penalty is a deterrent, right? Whether it lowers the crime rate. And so all the subjects in the study read a scientific study, like a page and a half long description of a study about how you would study this, and the methodology was always the same, right? And then they just changed the results. So some people read the methodology and said, oh yeah, the death penalty deters crime, right, makes murder rates go down, or same methodology, the death penalty doesn't deter crime, doesn't do anything, right? So exactly the same methodology, but different conclusion. And then they bring in people who have a prior attitude that they're capital punishment proponents or the capital punishment opponents. And then you ask them, well, how good a study was that, right? So they rated all kinds of different things, whether that was a good piece of scientific research, right? And what you get is this classic pattern, which is that people think it's better research if it supports their beliefs than if it doesn't. So again, over here, you give them anti-deterrence, so the death penalty doesn't deter crime. Well, opponents think that's a great study, but opponents don't think it's such a good study at all. Right? This is going to how well conducted is the study. If it's a pro-deterrence study, says it definitely really works. Well, proponents say it's a good study, and opponents say it's a bad study. It's the same study. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same methods, right? But when it supports you, it's a great study. When it doesn't support you, it's not such a great study. And that's what you see again and again. People show this really fundamental tendency to sort of take in information they want to believe and reject it. And it's not just about science. Right? People do it every day. All of us do this a lot. So here's some examples. This is one of my favorite examples. How many people have shared something on the internet and then later found out that it was fake, that it was wrong? Right? Or how many people have caught somebody else doing that? One of your friends says, oh, that's right? Happens all the time. Here's my favorite example. It's a guy named Dinesh D'Souza, who's a well-known conservative pundit. And this was, I don't know how many years ago, 2015, and he found this picture of Hillary Clinton on the internet, and as you see here in the corner, there's a Confederate flag. And he says, look closely at this Hillary photo, isn't that a Confederate flag behind her on the bookshelf? So he shares that immediately. Literally about 10 minutes later, the entire internet comes back and says, dude, that's not real, right? Somebody just put that Confederate flag, and there's the real photo, and there's the Confederate flag in there. So it's fake, right? So you see it, you go, oh, this seems so great. It's got, and you share it, right, without thinking much about it. Of course, his response was sort of a nasty one. He said, well, even if the Confederate flag was edited into this Hillary photo, what is going on with those glasses and that hairdo? He didn't even comment on her pants, right? Which I was glad of, because this was me wearing the same pants when I was about 10, I think. So I was glad he didn't attack the pants, right? Right, but this is what happens with all of you. If you get something that doesn't seem right to you, you go, wait a minute, let me think about that. Let me do some research. You get something that feeds what you want, you just say, oh, great, that seems great. And you send it off, right? The quick share, right? Give you another example. So, remember this picture I just showed you, right? I had this, I'm using some version of this. I update it all the time when I give talks, right? There's one picture in here that I remember finding, and thought, oh, this is great. It's this one here. Right? Make America white again. Oh, I remember finding, oh, that's so perfect. Then one of my graduate students came about a year ago, he goes, that's not a real picture, you know. It's one of those where they just put words on people, right, on their t-shirt. So it's complete fake news. I fell for it. It fit perfectly for me. It just seemed so great, right? Oh, but if it would have said on the other side, communism rules or something, you know, on a bunch of liberal t-shirts, I would have said, oh, that's got to be fake. Right? But it didn't occur to me because it fit so perfectly with my worldview, right? And I just took it in. Right? And that's what happens. We take in the stuff we want to believe, we reject the stuff we don't want to believe. We take in the stuff that supports our political and moral views, and we're much less likely to take in information that doesn't. So again, we got the nested suits on one side, we got me on the other side. So yeah, and the question sort of arises very quickly, well, gee, are liberals or conservatives more likely to do this kind of stuff? Is one side more biased than the other? It's actually been a topic of a lot of discussion over the years. Very famously, I think you even mentioned it a little while ago, the Authoritarian Personality, which is this famous book by Adorno after World War II. And it sort of was the start of a tradition of sort of saying, well, you know, if you want to explain people who have this sort of conservative, you know, more authoritarian sort of leading, well, you know, it's like, yeah, there's some weird psychological stuff underlying that. They probably had a father that didn't give them love, and so they can't accept love for themselves. So they decide that they blame things on other people. So the idea there was the idea was conservatism is biased, liberalism is rational, correct, right? And then there's another view, which is this a view more that the two sides are probably about equally biased. Everybody's biased, but they just have different patterns, right? They're like mirror images of each other, right? One side favors liberal stuff, one side favors conservative stuff, right? So we wanted to see if that was true. We wanted to try and test and see if we could get some data on whether one side was more biased than the other. And nobody actually seriously considers the side that liberals are more biased than conservatives. It's possible, right? But it's usually conservatives are more biased than liberals, or the two sides are equally biased, or the two sides of the argument. So what we did is we took every study we could find like this. And there are a bunch of them. There's tons of people have done studies where they give people basic, some kind of information. Sometimes it's scientific information. Sometimes it's something like an executive order, right? Is that a morally acceptable executive order that a Republican president or a Democratic president does? But you can find, and they all have this thing. You give them exactly the same information. You change whether it's liberal friendly or conservative friendly. And then what we did is we figured out a way that you could sort of measure bias. So essentially what we did is we compared these two. So this is how much they accept it when it supports their views, and this is how much they accept exactly the same information when it doesn't support their views. So the difference between those is that's the error, that's the bias that you're showing, right? Similarly, on this side, you can measure that bias and get an index of how biased liberals and conservatives are in this situation. Right, then you can put a number on that. We call these effect sizes, doesn't matter, right? Kind of which one's bigger. You can calculate something. In this case, it actually the Republicans were, the Republican side, which is, it's not perfect in this study because death penalty is not perfectly, it's not partisan in particular. I mean, it is partisan, but it's not perfectly partisan by any stretch. But the kind of conservative side on this side showed more bias than the people who had the more liberal view. right? So essentially what we did is we just took every study we could find and we calculated those things. We put them all together. It's called a meta-analysis, where you take the results of a whole bunch of studies and you put them all in and you statistically analyze it, rather than just sort of reviewing what you see, right? You statistically analyze what kind of the findings across these studies. So we ultimately found 51 studies, about 18,000 people, all had this particular design, right? So this says that on this side it's more accepting of conservative information than liberal information. Going this way, it's more accepting of liberal information than conservative information, right? And when you compare the two, you see, well, both sides are biased. So everybody shows this tendency. They're more likely to accept the same information if it supports what they want to believe than if it doesn't support what they want to believe. Everybody shows that, and the two sides show it to almost exactly the same degree. Right? So this is 2.5 to 2.35. Right? Now a lot of people go, I have heard this before, people go, ugh, right? They sort of suck in and go, is that true? And so let me just be clear about what it means, right? This doesn't mean that the two sides' views about the world right now are equally valid or correct or anything like that, right? This is studying bias under the most highly controlled situation you could possibly have, right? It's exactly the same information, it just is switched. We have to make judgments right away in all these studies, right? So the way to think about it is it's the propensity for bias, right? That both sides have the propensity to take in information they want to believe and reject information they don't. And everybody does it. It's probably the most fundamental bias in all of psychology. It's often referred to as my side bias. That people just, if it's good for us, we like to take it in. If it's bad for us, we reject it. If it's good for our team, we like to take it in. If it's bad for our team, we reject it. Right? Everybody shows this, and both sides show this equally in these highly controlled laboratory situations. Now, what's going to happen, what can happen, right, is societal conditions come in there and sort of change how much this might operate, or how might magnify it under some conditions, right? But both sides are clearly equally likely to commit these sorts of biases. So lots of bias to go around. That's factualization. Let me talk finally in this last part. So you guys know about Wikipedia, right? How many people knew that there's a conservapedia? There's actually a conservapedia that has conservative facts in it. Right, so you could go and you go, well, those liberal, I look up things on Wikipedia, it seems too liberal for me, so I'm going to go over to Conservapedia and I'm going to ask those questions. They're going to give me an answer that's more like what I want, right? This is a good example of the way I talk about this idea of socialization, right? So the last part of this, right, is it's moralized, and then people have these biases that they sort of suck in and bring facts to support their moral views. And then ultimately what happens is those things get stamped into people through socialization, through hearing the same information all the time from the same people. I really mean socialization in exactly the same way that a sociologist or anybody would talk about it. It's just learning the norms and values and beliefs of a culture, right? And you clearly see this, that the two sides are sort of splitting in this interesting way, right? So, this is a crowd that I don't have to talk too much about this. When I talk to college students, I have to explain it a little bit. Right? I grew up in a 3-channel world. Right? There's there's 5 channels. There's ABC, CBS, NBC. There was KTTV. I grew up in Southern California, so it was Channel 11, Channel 13. There's PBN. There were like 6 stations. That was it. Right? You might have some crazy belief that you heard during the day, right, about something, and then you sat down, you watched Walter Cronkite that night, and he told you what the real truth was. You go, okay, good. Right? And it converged everybody together. That is not the world that we live in now. So we live in a world where there's hundreds of places to get news, on cable TV, on the internet. Everybody knows now what ideology those places endorse. Right? So we know what the liberal stations are. We know what the conservative stations are. So it's easy for people to just go to those places they feel comfortable and get their information, right? And you see that has sort of 2 basic effects on people. So one is that people selectively expose themselves, not that way, they selectively expose themselves to information that supports their views, right? So liberals go to MSNBC, they go to the New York Times, they go to other liberal outlets to get their news. Conservatives go to the Fox News, OAN, Newsmax, these new kind of conservative places, and they get the kind of news that they expect. And what happens and people clearly go out and do that, once they do that, what happens to them is it just reinforces or socializes them. They go, yeah, here's this thing I thought. Wow, a whole bunch of other people think that too. And they're wearing ties, and they look just like those people. And, wow, great. I must be right. Or you hear that other people believe the same thing you believe, and there's nothing that makes people believe something more than knowing that somebody else believes it too. Right? Having other people believe things makes you think that they're true. Right? And that's why I always talk about partisan bias as a team sport. It's not that I have to think up all the things that are wrong with the data. I go, gee, I don't like those. I don't like that finding. And somebody you talk to says, oh, you know why that's wrong? And they tell you, oh, you're right. That is wrong. Great, thank you. And then you tell somebody else, right? And everybody reinforces each other, and you end up with these things that you wanted to believe, and you might you kind of say that you endorse, and then they become truth because everybody else around you believes them too. Right? And there's you can show lots of evidence. This is just I'm showing out some of my graduate students' data. This is this interesting data where I think these were Pew data that you looked at from 2000 to 2012, and then constructed an index of whether people are just, how much are liberals looking at liberal news, how much are conservatives looking at conservative news. So higher numbers are you're looking at more news that's consistent with what you want to believe. And the first thing over here on this left side that you see is that this is going up. Right? So people are more and more getting ensconced in their own news, in their own echo chamber. In this case, you see that Republicans are actually doing that significantly more than Democrats in this case. Well, then he got interested in sort of breaking it down a little bit more. So he actually then broke it down by whether they're liberal or very liberal, conservative or very conservative, right? And then you see a slightly different pattern. So again, you see that, again, selective exposure, this idea of kind of watching the news that supports your views is still going up, but there's one real outlier group here. That's the extreme conservatives. Very conservative people are out here really consuming their own news, but the group that has the most balanced news diet are the conservatives. Right? The moderate conservatives are the ones that are most likely to be watching both kinds of news. And then Democrats, liberals are there in the middle. So it's kind of interesting. Again, I think we all sense that, right? Is that there's a bifurcation actually in both parties, right? So, but clearly you've got the MAGA wing of the Republican Party and a more moderate group, right? And we have a similar thing on the Democratic side, right? But this is the problem. A lot of the problems seem to be this one group that's really, again, sort of living in their own media environment. So this is like traditional media. Same thing happens on the internet. These are just great data. They look at tweets, millions of tweets, and whether people from conservative places are tweeting across the liberal places or retweeting each other, or whether they're just doing it, among themselves. You see clearly what you get is a bunch of conservative people tweeting and sites tweeting with each other and hanging out with each other, and these liberal groups doing the same thing on the other side. Right? So on the internet, the same kind of thing happens. But it also happens physically, right? So there's this phenomenon that's called the big sort, right? Where so increasingly Americans live in places that are largely populated by people just like them. So liberals live with liberals, conservatives live with conservatives, right? So it's not just that what you're seeing on the internet, it's like you go around you and all you have are people just like you. And they believe the same things you do. They watch the same media you do, right? And you just sort of reinforce each other. This is this book by Bill Bishop. The Big Sort is a really fascinating book where he goes through all the data. And basically, the sort of piece of data that's easy to understand, more or less, is he looks at how many precincts in the country had landslide elections, where more than 20, one side won by more than 20%. Which indicates that you're in a district that's really skewed, that most of the people are one party or the other. And you see that in 2004, there's almost none like that. Everyone that's marked, right? These are all the landslide ones, and most of the countries, really, half the country's not, and half the country is. And with each successive year, right, the country just gets more filled in, where almost all these ones that are marked are landslide districts, where almost everybody, or more than 20% of the more of one party is voting in the direction of the other one, right? So it indicates we're sort of living in these residential safe spaces, right? Where everybody around us kind of believes the same things we believe. It just does the same thing. You just hear the same stuff that you've heard and that you kind of want to believe, and all these other people believe it too, and it really sort of drives it home, right? So you end up with these three processes, right? Moralization, factualization, and socialization. They all sort of feed into each other. So the more angry we get at the other side, the more we think they're evil, the more that fuels us to process information and suck in all the things and the reasons why we're right and they're wrong. The more we do, when we do that, then we're more likely to socialize and hang out with people who are just like us. And the more you socialize, it increases the factualization. And the more that you believe these things, that you believe one thing and they believe the other, the more you dislike them. How can they possibly believe that? How can these people possibly believe these crazy things that they believe? Man, they're so bad and they're so biased that I just don't like them, right? And so these processes, they don't go in any direction, they sort of just all feed on each other. And the other thing I like to note is that they're perfectly natural processes, right? This is the way groups interact with each other, right? If you've ever been in sports teams, sports is a great analogy for politics, right? The way people, Red Sox and Yankees fans, you can find people that hate each other as much as Democrats and Republicans do, right? And they do the same thing, right? Their team's morally good, the other team's shady, and then any close call, you pull to your side, clearly, that was pass interference. I was watching football on Sunday night, there were two bad pass interference calls, right? You can see that your side, you sort of interpret them that way, right? So these are all groups, if they hang out together, tend to moralize things, they tend to factualize things, they tend to socialize things, right? But it can get out of control in various ways. It has this sort of cycling, self-escalating nature to it, but there also can be perturbed by other kinds of things. So one thing, for example, technology is probably one of the things that's fueling the problem now, right? It's so easy to find information that supports your views, right? And then the ease of it all, and the rapid exchange of information probably exacerbates all this. These things can also be exacerbated by political actors, right? You can create conflict. You can sort of juice this model, right? Like keep telling people the other side's evil, the other side's evil. Don't believe their fake news. All of everything they say is fake news, it's wrong. Believe our news. Fox News you can believe. MSNBC you can't, or the other way around, right? So Donald Trump is a good example of someone who's been sort of juicing this. Fox News generally probably juices the problem, right? It's also the case that the two sides don't operate independently from one another. One side pokes one, the other it pokes them back, right? They move each other. So the more extreme one side gets, the more extreme the other side gets. Right? The whole thing just sort of fuels. And again, political actors. A thing I like to say about American politics is it's not sort of an evolutionarily normal situation, right? Human history is populated by us splitting into small groups and trying really hard to beat up and kill the people that don't look like us, right? We are not built to be in a multicultural democracy where you're trying to make decisions with people who don't look like you, who don't believe the same things you do, don't believe the same gods you believe in, right? People tend to fight in those situations. So democracy, this wonderful sort of American experiment, right, is to try to get people to do that. But it's an uphill evolutionary battle. You got to kind of push this big rock up to make it happen. But fomenting conflict is really easy, right? You can just make conflict. You can just kind of tell people that the other side's bad, the other side's wrong, they've wronged you, right? That's the downhill putt. Right? So it's really easy to create conflict. It's hard to bring people together, and that's why it's such a precarious situation that we're in right now, in my opinion. And a wonderful quote to end with. This is James Mad Dog Mattis, who was defense secretary for Donald Trump. And what he wrote in his book is, "What concerns me most as a military man is not our external adversaries, it's our internal divisiveness. We are dividing into hostile tribes, cheering against each other, fueled by emotion and a mutual disdain that jeopardizes our future, instead of rediscovering our common ground and finding solutions." So I think that's a good characterization of the problem, and thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, I'm going to be the first questioner.
There you go.